what's up guys? Today I'm going to be talking about cat builds, and I'm going to go pretty in depth here. And I know Katarina got some new juicy items that she could use, like the Kraken and Guinsoos, and we're going to talk about all of that and all the different builds that we can go. Excuse my voice is a little bit worn out, but I hope you guys can still understand me. And so first off, I want to talk about like the philosophy of Katarina builds. And so let's say, for example, let's use the AP as an example, right? So AP build, something that we're all very familiar with. When it comes to cat builds, she's an assassin. And so whatever gives her the most damage is going to be a very viable build. And that's mainly what we're looking for, right? So when you go like AP build, when you go like Nashers into Proto Belt, Nashers really sets off, like this is going to be your main source of damage when you go AP. And so Nashers into even more AP is always going to be really good. Like it doesn't even matter what AP build you go. This is why this build's consistent, and it's still good to this day, even after the AP, the on-hit items that come in. Just having more AP items is going to help get you stronger and stronger and stronger, and then you have something like Proto Belt that gives you more pen, which gives you more damage, and then you go into Shadow Flame, which gives you more damage. And so that's kind of the philosophy you have to think about. And when it comes to the Divine build, which is something popular, but I don't think it's that strong anymore because it did get nerfed, the healing got reduced by 2%, which makes a really big difference. And so, but I'm just using this as an example because this goes against what I'm talking about when it comes to the philosophy of Katarina builds. But the reason why this build works is because when you have someone like Katarina who can play Bruiser and is able to survive and tank and still do damage, the build is OP. Right? And we all know this from the last season. And so I've been playing tank cat like ever since I started like really playing cat, right? I used to go like Sunfire, I used to go Abyssal Scepter, and those two items actually gave you a lot of damage and a lot of tankiness. And so this build sort of does the same thing, right? Or it used to. You went Divine, you go into Wits, you go into Randuin's. In 3 items, you were able to get MR, you're able to get armor, you're able to get damage with the Wits End, and you're also able to get healing and sustain from Divine. And the good thing about this build is that even with the AP build, every item is influential when it comes to building. And so Divine was a really good first item to go. It helped you win lane. It made you really scary, and it made you a really good fighter because of the healing. And then afterwards, you go into the on-hit item. It gives you MR, but sometimes the MR isn't really relevant if they have a lot of AD damage, and that's completely fine because you still get the damage from the Wit's End. So it's efficient. You still get damage, you still get on-hit damage, and then you round out your build with more armor and you get health, and then you put those all together and boom, you're like covering all and everything that comes your way, right? You're covering AP damage, you're covering armor. And so when you have a build like this where you have sustain, you have a lot of tankiness, and you still do damage, it'll be OP. But right now, I don't think we have a build like that anymore because Divine did get nerfed, and I think that's what Riot wants. And so who knows, maybe we'll find a build like this, but this is the philosophy when it comes to Bruiser Cat and Tank Cat. But we're going to be mainly talking about Damage Cat. And so just to say again, it's about doing the most damage with the little items that you get. Every item's got to be influential. Nashers, great first item. And then Proto Belt gives you the utility, gives you health, gives you pen. And it will continue to give you pen with every item that you get, which is going to be really good. And then you continue to go into more damage. Therefore, like every item you buy is going to influence your build. Okay, so that's kind of the philosophy I want you guys to have when it comes to building Katarina. Now, this is something that I want to talk about because I feel like I get a lot of like comments of people saying like, hey, you should try out this build. Where you go like, the thing is they show like 5 items and they're like, yo, this build is really good when you have all these items together. And I'm like, it's not, because what has to happen is that every item you buy has to be able to get you through that phase of the game. And so when you go like Nashers into Proto Belt into Zhonya's, like you're building Zhonya's for that phase of the game. If you don't need it, then you go into more damage and you can continue your build that way. But again, every item has to be influential. So for example, if someone suggests me a build like this, where they go like, okay, go Nashers into DD into Wit's End and then go into Deathcap Voice Staff, this build's really cool because like you're able to tank and then you're able to get a lot of damage because you have pen, you have Deathcap. Okay, right. But then, what happens when you have Nashers DD? Like, are you really that strong until you get the Wit's End? You really need armor in this phase of the game. What if they're AD damage isn't really that strong, maybe you want to go with second instead. And then if that's the case and you go into DD, like do you really need DD? Do you need to assassinate more? Are you snowballing, right? Like, are you snowballing, or do you need to be able to kill their squishies? And if that's the case, then you might have to go like more into damage instead. You guys get what I'm saying? It's like, don't fall into the trap of like looking at the complete build and be like, wow, all these builds work really well together. You need to really think about each build that you buy, each item that you buy. So like, know that Nashers is really good. If you just want pure damage, Nashers. Oh, Proto Belt's good. It gives me pen. It gives me more damage on my Nash. This is going to be a good spike for me. And then I go into Shadow Flame because like I get extra pen off the Proto Belt, and then Shadow Flame will give me 100 AP, but also give me like up to 20 pen, and that's going to be really good. So I'll be scaling up on the damage. And if my team needs that damage at that point, then yes, it's good. You get what I'm saying? And so the first 2 or 3 items is going to be very important, because at this point, if you need like your 4th and 5th item to really round out your build, then it's going to be a very inconsistent build, because it's going to take too long to get there. And a lot of times you don't really have the luxury to finish your build. A lot of times you're only going to be building like 2 to 3 items, right? And so it's kind of the philosophy I want you guys to have. Really focus on the first, second, and third item. See how influential they are in that phase of the game, and then try to work your build off from there. A lot of times you're not really fixated on a build. You really can't. The game doesn't let you. If the game's always going to be moving. You can't build like your 5th item and then round out your build. It doesn't make sense. You really have to round out your game plan of the build, like the first 3 items. So remember that. Don't fall into that trap. If you're ever going to think of like a cap build, think of the first 3 items and how strong they are and how efficient they will be in the game. And that's why, for example, I always go into like an on-it item first, because I know this will make me strong on the first item, like the first buy that I have, and it's going to be really strong for the early game. Whereas like I can't really buy wits first, because yes, maybe wits would be good, and then going into the DD second would be good because you have on hit, you have armor, you have MR, yes, but then the wits end isn't really that strong early. It needs to scale, and then like you really need the armor at that point. Like you get what I'm saying? And so all I'm saying is be careful for that trap. Okay, so now let's start going into the on-it items, but I do want to talk about Kraken and Guinsoo's. So what happened with Kraken and Guinsoo's is that Kraken doesn't give you true damage anymore, but it has AD and AP scaling, and it still does that like 3rd on-hit proc that Kraken normally did. It's just magic damage now. But the important thing is it scales off AD and AP. So you can scale it with whatever item that you build, really, whatever damage item. And then you have Guinsoo's that gives you both AD and AP. And it has a passive where like you're able to proc your on hits more often. And so these 2 items work really well together, right? And so that's what we're going to try to utilize in these builds. Now, in terms of the build order between these 2, I like going to Kraken first before the Guinsoo's, because I think Kraken has a good synergy with, on-it items. Like if you were to go like Bork or Nash first, Kraken can complement that first item. And so because Nashers gives AP, if you go Kraken scales off of AP, and so you're increasing the damage of Kraken with the Nasher's Tooth. And then you can go into Guinsoo's afterwards, and Guinsoo's will give you more damage after building the Kraken, because you already have crit on your Kraken and then you have crit on your Guinsoo's. So it's weird building Guinsoo's second, because it doesn't have a crit item to scale off of. And so I like to do it this way instead, because I think Kraken is a bigger spike than Guinsoo's if you were to build it this way. Okay, so that's the philosophy with like the on-it items. Now let's start going into the builds. And so the first thing I want you to do, and it's worked well for me, is building an on-it item first. And so Bork, let's just use Bork. You can go Bork or Nash. So these are going to be 2 different builds, but the important thing is you build one on-it item first. So it's either going to be Bork and Nash, and I'm going to just talk about the Bork here. So Bork is a really good, strong standalone item, and you can pretty much one-shot anything with Bork once you build it, and it's really good, especially like your enemy laner. It's really easy to like deal a lot of upfront damage with Bork, and it's like super strong. But the thing is, prior, Bork wasn't really an item that can scale, right? It always had a problem with scaling. But this time around, we have items that can actually somewhat scale the Bork. So that's why Bork actually increased in value. And so when it comes to this build, you go Kraken, and then you go Guinsoo's. Now you go Bork, your on it item, and then you go into Kraken. Now, Kraken actually gets more damage from Bork because Bork gives AD. So no matter what you go, whether you build AD or AP, Kraken's going to get stronger. And it's going to be better this way because Bork is actually stronger than Kraken first item, and so you go the Bork first so you can actually play the game. And then you go into Kraken, and then you go into Guinsoo's. Guinsoo's is going to scale off the Kraken, and then Guinsoo's will also be able to give you more Kraken procs and more Bork procs. So then these 3 items right here, boom. It's good synergy together, and it makes you actually very strong. And so this is definitely one build to go. And if you were to continue to go and continue the build here, you can utilize that Kraken and Guinsoo's are both AP damage. And so if that's the case, you can start going into Pen. Pen items are good. You can go into Shadow Flame. You can go into Void Staff even. And this would increase your damage overall. Your abilities still do magic damage. And so you're going to benefit off of Pen just in general. But also, a lot of your damage is going to be coming from Guinsoo's and Kraken as well, and so it's going to complement those 2 items on top of all of your abilities. So that's one angle to go. Now you can kind of really flex like after these 3 items. I think the important part is these 3 items are how you should build it in this order, and then you start going into whatever you want. You can even go into Wits, because builds centered focused around Guinsoo's here, and so you can even go more crit if you want. If you've seen my last video, I go into BT. We can talk about this build later, but building into more crit is not a bad option to skill the Guinsoo's here. Or you can go into the more AP route and try to spike as soon as possible with your 4th item. And so what's important is these 3 items, and then you can kind of be flexible with the next 2 items. Now for the next build, it's going to be the AP build. So you go into Nashers first, and then you go into Kraken. Kraken scales off of AP, and so Nashers is going to be able to buff up the Kraken, and then it just gives you like 2 really solid on-hit items, and then you can go into Guinsoo's here. And so Nashers, Kraken, Guinsoo's is going to be able to proc Nashers a lot more, and with the Kraken as well, and your build is mainly going to be focused on these 2 now. You're going to try to scale these 2 at this point. And so after your Guinsoo's, you can go into Shadow Flame, you just go into AP. And because Nashers is going to get a lot stronger, and then you have Guinsoo's that will make Nashers proc a lot more, and so that's where a lot of your damage is going to come from. And the Kraken as well. So the Kraken also has AP scaling, and so just more AP is really good. This is actually the stronger build path when it comes to the using Kraken and Guinsoo's, just because it scales really well. But you don't really get strong until after you don't really get super dumb strong until after the 4th item. So once you build let's say Death Cap here, you're going to be really strong, and so scales really well. And this is just your somewhat standard AP build, just AP burst, but you can utilize the on hits a lot more, so your auto attacks will do a lot more. You're not going to be as bursty as AP, but you'll shred people down for sure. And so these 3 items, the focus is to scale the Kraken and the Nash, so you can go into more AP items afterwards. And you can go into Zhonya's if you want, whatever it is. If you need Pen, yeah, you can kind of flex those AP items as well. But that's kind of the point with this build. And so remember, it's very strong too, so pretty good build. So that's how I would go with the on-it items. And the next build I want to show is just the AP build. The AP build is still good. Now, when it comes to this build here, it's going to be your standard AP build. You just build it normally. I'm pretty sure we all know how to build it at this point. But the one thing that happened was that Death Cap actually got buffed, and it gives you 40% AP instead of 35%, which is a really nice change. And so AP did get buffed, so once you're able to build this Death Cap, you're actually going to do a lot of damage. There's never really been a problem with AP Cat here. AP Cat is still really strong. The thing that makes this build better than the on-hit build is that you're a little bit more flexible, right? And your playstyle is a little bit more safer. So you can go into Zhonya's if you want 3rd item. That's a really nice flexible item to go. And then you can go into Shadow Flame. You can still go Zhonya's in the other builds, But in order for you to completely utilize and optimize your builds on the on-hit builds, going Zhonya's third is kind of weird. You can go into like Nashers, Kraken, Zhonya's, but this throws off the build just a little bit, even though the AP from the Zhonya's is going to scale these two, so it's not like too bad, but you don't spike as hard. And so it's still a viable build looking at it, but just going something like this will give you a little bit more burst and really buff up the Nashers here. One thing to note actually is that when it comes to Kraken and Guinsoo's, Kraken actually does more damage over time if you're hitting the proc onto one target over and over. And then Guinsoo's, you need 4 auto attacks in order for you to actually get the buff. And so because of that, it's not as bursty, right? When you have a build like AP, when you're going this, all your damage is up front. You hit them with like your abilities. Your abilities do a lot more damage because you're just like buffing them up with AP, like your Shimpo, your Q. And so you're able to utilize just raw damage up front with this build. Whereas like with these, you need to get your on hits procced. And so you can kind of see like the differences within the builds and what they excel in, right? And so yeah, the AP build is still good. Just build it normally as you would. Just know that Death Cap got buffed. So once you build Death Cap, you'll be stronger than you were before. Still a very good build, solid build. Next, I do want to talk about the Lifesteal build. If you saw my last video, the Lifesteal build is something that I've been testing around with a lot. And so I want to explain the idea of like the Ginsoos and the Lifesteal, because normally Cat ult doesn't give you Lifesteal. But then, for some reason, Guinsoo procs, the on-hit on Ginsoos procs Lifesteal. And this build actually makes a lot of sense too. So this build's actually not that bad. So when you go Bork, you get Lifesteal, and you get the on-hit damage, and you get like a solid first item, and then you go into Ginsoo's. Now, Ginsoo's second isn't really the strongest, but lucky for you, Bork is super strong. And so like if you're able to get more Bork procs off, that makes it's like these two items pretty strong. And so this works surprisingly well. And then you go into Crit Lifesteal. Now the crit is going to help buff up the Rage Blade, and so does Shield Bow, because Shield Bow has crit too, and they both give you Lifesteal. All these 3 items aside from the Ginsoos gives you Lifesteal. And so this is why the build works, right? And so it's cohesive. The build is cohesive. That's why I've been testing it around a lot with it, because I think there is potential. I wouldn't say it's completely optimal, but I would say it's a lot of fun to use. And as long as it's cohesive, it will perform pretty good in your games. Now we can sort of talk about other ideas in which angles we can go, because obviously we are still early in this phase. We just got Kraken and Guinsoo's buffed, and so you never know what areas we can go with the builds. But I do want to talk about like Kraken first. So I know there's a lot of people talking about Kraken first, but I think that Kraken first isn't really that strong. And I think going Ginsoo's afterwards doesn't really make it that much better. Even though these two builds, these two items actually work well together, it's like you have better options. Like if you actually want to win your game, going Bork, going Nashers are a lot more consistent and a lot more useful in my opinion. And I think consistency is a big thing, because if you're using Kraken, like you can't really get consistent damage. Whereas like Bork is very consistent, Nashers is very consistent, and it makes a lot of sense, right? And so you want to spike with these. Building Kraken first doesn't really give you that big spike that you get from like Nashers and Bork. And so the one good thing about actually doing this, where you go Kraken first into Ginsoos, is that you're able to scale a lot more gold efficiently, right? So like if you're able to get away with Kraken first into Ginsoos, then you can start going into like more crit. This way, the build is more oriented on Ginsoos now. Ginsoos is going to be your prime damage source. And so having all your items like have crit on them, and then building up the damage on the Rage Blade is actually going to be really good in the long run. But it's just about being able to survive with these two items, because these two items aren't really that strong together. And that's why I like focusing on the first on-hit items and then try to work around those instead. But I think that's the one benefit, is that if we can find some way to like really have the build centered around Rage Blade, I think it could be a pretty good build. Now, maybe we can even talk about Rage Blade first, but I think you should never do this. It doesn't scale off anything. It's not really that self-sufficient of an item. It does give you on hit, but it's a lot of gold, and it also gets value from like having more legendary items, because pen is a really good stat, right? Like having both the armor pen and the magic pen is really good for you, and so just building the Rage Blade alone first item doesn't feel that strong, so I wouldn't recommend it. Now, another possible angle that we can go is just kind of utilizing the Kraken. And so when it comes to Kraken, again, it scales off of AD and AP. And so when you have this flexibility, you can go something like Bork Kraken into DD, Wits End, and now you can have armor, you can have MR, you get extra on hits on the Wits End, and then maybe you can go into the Rage Blade after for the pen and the extra on hits. Like, this isn't a bad build either. It's just I'm just trying to emphasize like Kraken's flexibility, just because it can get stronger with any damage item you go. Like, you can go Death Cap. I mean, this build isn't really cohesive, but it's not bad because Kraken will get stronger off of the Death Cap. Shadow Flame also might not be bad. Maybe this would make a little bit more sense, so that you can actually buff up both of your Kraken and your Gnasher's Tooth, and then you get the pen from the Shadow Flame, so maybe you can do more damage that way. So I'm just trying to open up some possibilities and just letting you know that Kraken is a very flexible item that you can scale. And so there's more possibilities there. We just need to try to test out a lot more different builds and see what's the best and optimal way to go. But yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. That's the on it build that I've been going. Remember, things can always change, but I think this is a really good starting point, because I've been doing this build constantly, like going either Bork or Gnashers first into Kraken and Guinsoo's, and it's been working completely fine. I would say that the AP build is still really strong, and you might want to play the AP build more so in some games, but even then, like, I like testing builds, and so I'm going to try these builds regardless and continue to play them, even though they're not like completely optimal in the situation that I put them in. Hope you guys got some insight. Hope you guys understand how to build Katarina more so. And I stream on Twitch. I play all my games on Twitch. You guys should definitely check me out. I started streaming again, and if you want to see me play and try out new builds or whatever it is, then you guys should totally check it out. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys next time.